podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone, dear listeners, to our episode today. Today, we're talking about the value equilibrium system. I've called it the value equilibrium system, how we can discover and purposefully develop our uniqueness. Human potential is limitless, and of course, we want to recognize and make the most of it as best we can. How have I structured today's episode? I'll start with a short prologue about personal values and then also goals, which we definitely won't just sweep under the rug here. I think they're a prerequisite, but still not sufficient. Just like so often, things are necessary, but not sufficient, and we need to think further. And that's why, after the prologue, my first main point is about the triad when it comes to values. And triads are something really special for us humans. I'll give a few examples of that as well. In the second point, I'll talk about values, spaces, and also briefly touch on the value matrix, which many of you are already familiar with, because ultimately, it forms the basis of the equilibrium system. My third part deals with the different forms, including possible extremes or balances that could result in one thing or another, and in the fourth part, I'll simply give some tips on how we, or how you, can move forward here. And of course, I'll also draw a brief conclusion. Let's get started. So, when we talk about values, most of the time we're talking about personal, substantive values. And you ask, what is important to you? What are your top 10 values, your top 3, and so on? I've really devoted a lot of attention to this myself. For me, love is a very important value, along with family, especially freedom and independence, but also a few others. And of course, there are an incredible number of them. I once developed a worksheet for this, which is also included in my book, or rather, you can download it from my most recently published book. I'll quickly add the download link to the show notes as well. It's a worksheet that helps you both gather and distill these values with the help of a values database I've included, and at the same time, it also connects them to your personal goals to relate them to each other. Because when my goals align with my personal values, that's when I gain traction. But if these goals don't align with my values, then there's friction, and ultimately, that leads to a loss of energy. So, there are countless personal values, and in the end, it's really important to identify them, as well as the goals that go with them, like I mentioned. So ultimately, in the end, what comes out of it is where I feel comfortable and where I don't. And we have two sides within us. One is what's called homeostasis, as Leon Pomeroy put it. That's basically the medical task of bringing us into physical balance. So, no illness, good health, and everything in the body working properly. But alongside this homeostasis, we also have psychostasis, meaning the mental side. Fortunately, in recent years and decades, more attention has been paid to this, recognizing that both are equally important. And what are good values for me, and what are bad ones? So, it's also about recognizing what can throw me off balance, into imbalance. Yeah, and maybe there are some that I just don't care about at all. So, it's really about distinguishing between what's good for me, what's bad for me, and what's ultimately irrelevant. But these personal values aren't a system. They're very, very individual, as the name suggests, which makes comparisons difficult and also makes it hard to recognize imbalances without a systematic approach. That's why, Step 1, the triad, the 3 value dimensions by Robert S. Hartman. But that's not as unique as it might seem, or as I sometimes emphasize. These triads have actually been around for quite a while. So, in many, well, let's say, philosophies and religions, it's a common theme. Of course, it's also about these 3 value dimensions, about the person, about the thing itself, and ultimately about reason, about reflection. And the concept of body, mind, and soul is also something that's widely known. So, Hartman isn't out there all on his own. He might just be approaching it in a particularly scientific way, which can sometimes be a bit of a hindrance. But there are actually a lot of concepts that use this triad between the physical, the rational, and also open up and connect with the mental spiritual side so that it all comes together as a greater whole. And I mean, we humans, we love these triads, and you find them in so many different areas. A good friend of mine even wrote an article about it once. All good things come in threes. So, we humans really have a thing for these three dimensions. I'll give you a few examples. For instance, physical space. There, of course, we have height, width, and depth, which everyone knows, but you can also go in other directions. For example, how about traffic, road traffic? There's right, left, and straight ahead. Or take time, for example, we have the past, present, and future. And if we apply it to life, of course, we have childhood, youth, and adulthood. And then, of course, seniority, old age. Or take completely different areas, like music. There, too, we have three dimensions. We can play softer or louder, we can play faster or slower, or ultimately play the note earlier or later. So, it's a fascinating story, and in our context, it's really practical and human. And basically, the triad we're talking about, or systemically, as I often say. But now it's about the expansion. And that's where Hartman already plays a role. Second point, values, spaces, and from that, the matrix is derived. That's already a concept that isn't as widespread as the three value dimensions. I've never really seen it worked out in such detail elsewhere, where you say, valuing outside our skin and inside. Valuing within our skin. That we have our worldview, everything around us, the environment, and our self-view, everything that happens within us. And that's why this separating organ, the skin, I think, is such an important aspect, and also a nice metaphor that can be easily conveyed. And that's how the value matrix automatically unfolds, these 6 scales that are also reflected in our profiling value system. So we have heart, hand, and mind as value dimensions, or who, what, and for what purpose as the corresponding questions. We have the outside and the inside. And when we combine the heart with the outside, or the who with the outside, then we're talking about empathy, being with another person, understanding, and sensing them. If we combine the who or the heart with ourselves, then we're talking about ourselves as a person and our own unique. How we feel and experience things within ourselves, ultimately. When we combine the hand with the environment, meaning what's around us, then we see things and practically put them together so that they work to our benefit. If I combine the hand and the what with the self, then the question is, what am I myself? And then it's about the role I play. In society, in the working world, which is often what it's about for us as well. Of course, we have many roles in the different areas of life where we find ourselves. And then there's the brain, or the question of what it's all for, everything around us, so to speak, to look behind the things we grasp physically and use, and to recognize the principles behind them. Mathematics, physics, principles, systems. That's what we're capable of. And when we look at this internally, so the why and with reason, why am I here in this world, then it's really the question about the meaning of life, as Hartman so nicely puts it, the meaning of my life. So, then we have 2 columns, external and internal, and 3 rows, heart, hand, brain, or who, what, and why. And with that, we've just opened up the value equilibrium system. And now it's about. That's why, in my 3rd section, it's about the characteristics we can have here. And we want to talk about equilibriums, but also about how you can fall out of balance so that maybe you know how to get back into balance. And there are extremes due to dominance, especially with these 6 scales. Imagine someone is incredibly good at empathy, and not so much in the other 5 scales here in this value matrix. Then we'll probably be dealing with a helper syndrome pretty quickly, because that person is always thinking and feeling only in terms of others. And then everything else gets neglected. Not just themselves, but also things and considerations, maybe the strategic ones in the life plan, because you're only there, in the end, to help others. Or another extreme, where it's only about, who am I? So, my own person is seen very, very clearly and in a great light, and the other 5 aren't. In that case, I can very quickly slip into egocentrism, selfishness, or even narcissism. So, as you can see, these extremes can cause some pretty strong reactions. Or maybe another example, practical thinking, so the hands-on approach. And what's going on around me? It's good in this area, how someone can make things work, but in all the other 5 scales, not so much. If someone is going through life with a really, really clouded perspective, then they're constantly just doing things without seeing what others might need. And then we're quickly dealing with the action-driven type. So you can already see, when it comes to these extremes, when one scale dominates, you can pretty quickly say, whoa, we're out of balance here, things aren't running smoothly, literally. But if, in these 6 scales, I would say, there's a certain similarity, or as I like to put it, if one stands out a bit more but is still balanced by the others, then it doesn't become dominant, but can actually be used as a well-contained strength. Or another typical thing is actually the extremes between external and internal. So, people who are extremely sharp at noticing everything externally, but inside it's total chaos. They don't really know who they are as a person, they don't know what role they're supposed to play, and they don't have a life plan either. So, very quickly, we end up with overwhelm, burnout scenarios, and so on. And then, what you actually have on the outside, you can't really put into action anymore. And just to throw this in briefly, according to empirical research, about 80% of people tend to have a sharper view of the outside than the inside, so they see their surroundings more clearly than themselves. This means, as a consequence, that in some way they ultimately have a problem with themselves. And only 20% of society see more clearly inside than outside. Which quickly brings us to the point of saying, yes, that's good, nice for you, but the projection, so to speak, from the inside onto the outside leads to the realization that the world isn't the way you imagine it. It might even hit you in the face and you end up disappointed. So here too, you can see that a sense of balance is important, both between the outside and the inside. And now maybe another extreme. It's extreme, well, there are so-called open flanks. So, when we see, yes, 5 scales are actually pretty good. I say, empathy, practical thinking, yes, that's wonderful. Also, on the inside, things like self-respect, personal needs, awareness of one's roles, and goal orientation, those are all going fairly well too. But structured thinking is a real open flank, meaning it's much weaker compared to the other 5. So that's exactly the problem we have. Now, in the example I described, this person will keep struggling whenever it comes to planning, long-term thinking, or even considering what they should consciously choose not to do. And for whom not, simply because it doesn't align strategically with the direction. And in the same way, you can go around and say, out of all 6 scales, let's pick one that's particularly weak, for example, your own needs or self-esteem, meaning not being able to really feel or value yourself enough as a person. And all the others might be nice and good, the scales, but it will always show up as an open weakness that, in the end, I don't come across as authentic and confident, that I'm not sure of myself. And so you can now see, in reverse, that we have a problem here again when it comes to balance. Is concerned. And that's why it's so good in the system to be able to show or recognize it. So, what's important here would be to draw the conclusion to find a range, so that all 6 scales we're talking about are in a similar area, let's say, for really strong people, always somewhere between 70 and 90% in terms of ability. And then they're really, really strong, even in truly challenging, responsible positions. But then there are also some who are in a range of, let's say, 50 to 70, and maybe they're not as suited for society's more demanding roles. They might not take on highly responsible jobs, but within their own range, they're doing really well. And as has been nicely pointed out, it's really not up to us to decide which job is more important. More valuable or more important, bigger or smaller, he put it very, very nicely once. It's not so important what you do, but how you feel inside. So this inner attitude is the key element that's important here. And it's simply not our place to say that someone is more important or more valuable. Ideally, everyone contributes in their own unique way as best they can, at the place in society where it fits for them, and ultimately for others as well. So, finding your place within the range is about making use of diversity within your own range. Or maybe you have very similar traits everywhere, and then you don't have any open flanks. Then you might be the all-rounder, who's pretty decent at everything, so to speak, but maybe doesn't have such a strong profile with sharp edges and open flanks. And then sometimes you might come across as a bit boring. So, as you can see, the balance system really packs a punch. Of course, I'm exaggerating a bit here and maybe even being a bit polarizing, but in my opinion, it's absolutely fantastic to work with this system, because with just 6 scales, you already have endless variability if you calculate in percentages, in terms of how someone ultimately positions themselves. And our point here is to say that we can look at this a bit more systematically and objectively than if we were just analyzing personal values individually, as I mentioned in the prologue. This way, we can see and make use of the strengths. And that goes for the entire range, the whole matrix. We can not only promote the strengths, but also identify the weaker scales and balance them out as well. And as the saying goes, focus on your strengths. And of course, we shouldn't focus too much on our weaknesses. We'll never turn our weaknesses into strengths, but I think it's a really great saying that we should at least try hard enough to take the sharpest edges off our weaknesses, so they don't end up working against us, so they don't end up tearing down what we've already built. So, focusing on and developing strengths is important, but it's also important to blunt the negative extremes of our weaknesses. To blunt those extremes. And we can do this in a systematic way, but we should also stay flexible while doing so. Point 4, which I mentioned here, is about tips for systematically working on this balance of values and continually becoming the best version of yourself you can possibly be. So please, always see the journey as the goal. Right up until the very last day. Seen this way, we can't be perfect, and we shouldn't be, either. So, how do I do this, or what tips can I offer? Well, try looking at the situations you encounter through this framework, for example, the value dimensions. When you find yourself in a situation where there's a certain dynamic at work, take a look and ask yourself, okay, what's the human aspect here? And how does that feel? What's the practical aspect here? What are the requirements? And what's the bigger picture behind it? Where should things actually be heading? And to what extent are all these aspects being addressed in this situation? So, approaching things with this kind of framework is something that really helps to start with. And you can practice that, too. You can also sort of scan the people you meet and say, here, I've got a little so-called values compass developed, so you can kind of assign percentages when you get to know someone. From 0 to 100, where does this person stand on the human values dimension? From 0 to 100 on the practical one, and from 0 to 100 on the systemic or fundamental one as well. And you can adjust the percentages however you like, just to see where the person leans, or how they're likely to come across. And that helps a bit to understand things. But not just when it comes to other people, it's also about really listening to yourself. Who am I really, as a person? What defines me, without immediately thinking further about my job or my life plan? It's about listening inward, but also maybe really considering, hey, what is it that I do for work? What do I enjoy about it? And what don't I? How do I actually set boundaries there? How do I sharpen my professional role? And thinking about the future, where do I actually want to go in my life, in the different areas like partnership, family, work, social connections, meaning friends and acquaintances, and ultimately hobbies, special interests, or possibly other areas of life. And the matrix, or the value dimension, can also help with this, so here's another tip. Preparing for difficult situations or conversations, or whatever else may come up. To go in thinking, okay, now I'm dealing with a whole bunch of people here, and I have a specific goal to achieve with them. or something similar. How can I use these three value dimensions to prepare myself well so that I can strike the right balance? That would be, so to speak, ex ante, so, looking ahead. And just the same, the other way around, also thinking ex post, hey, something really went wrong there. Why did it actually go wrong? What was it that escalated? Were there human reasons behind it? Was it something practical? Was there something that fundamentally ran counter to the strategy? And maybe it was also within myself, not just with other people or, again, with them. So you really have to carefully tease out where, in the end, the core was that led to things tipping over or something similar. And that's why I sometimes give the tip, have a certain sense of mission when it comes to these three value dimensions. Or maybe also the matrix, especially with regard to the hierarchy of values. Because when we look at the working world, in my opinion, it's very much, maybe even too much, dominated in this way. Practically speaking, it's dominated, and sometimes even strategically, although the strategies are often wrong, so to speak, and the human aspect, the human value dimension, is simply undervalued. And Hartman once put it very nicely, that we make everything so simple. If we put the human aspect and human needs at the center in every situation, things would be much, much easier for us. So, you can also resolve certain conflicts if people are focused on value dimensions in the wrong places or maybe too much in certain areas. And that's why Hartman also nicely said, feel at ease. So here, it's about developing a certain ease or looseness. I hope these tips inspire you a bit and maybe even help you move forward. And I'll quickly wrap up with my conclusion here. 3 points. The first, you. So, knowing your individual personal values is really important. And that's kind of a precondition. You have to deal with that, otherwise you're basically flying blind and don't really know yourself, so to speak. Once again, a note about the show notes. I'll give you a download link there. Second point. The balance system, meaning this value matrix, is a really effective tool. It deliberately creates progress. You can actually work with it in a concrete way. And third point, just integrate it into your daily life. Heart, hand, and mind, inside and out. Hey, it's really simple. Anyone can remember that. Heart, hand, mind, outside and inside. And the combination basically happens automatically in your mind. And I observe where I step in and what it looks like. I think about how I get there. I'm critical of what went wrong somewhere. I examine myself. I examine others. Hey folks, honestly, there isn't an easier tool than this. And at the same time, it's so profound. I'd almost say it's right here. Emotionally and philosophically speaking. I hope I was able, in this time, to bring you a bit closer to this value balance system and show how we can actually put it to practical use. So, thank you very much for sticking with me right to the end. Please, I'd be happy if you gave us feedback on LinkedIn, on the platforms, followed us, and recommended us to others. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm already looking forward to the next episodes. See you very soon. Ciao.